So the purpose of this particular video is to look at what's the culture of Rome like, and understand when we say culture, we're doing our best to figure out not only the way of life, but also, to an extent, what they left behind. Now, one of the things people really think about when they say Rome. Now, the Romans developed an education system that's somewhat still in place today. Now, even though it's not free public education, there was a prominent Roman educator who stated that memory only exists even in small children, but is specially retentive at their age. They understood that when it came to education and learning, starting young was critical, absolutely critical, and progressing through various grade levels is more dependent on ability rather than age for the Romans. Now, there is no state-sponsored education, so that's where we see the rise of private tutors. Wealthy families could afford to hire them out. They would often begin with basic reading and writing, as well as learning just about the so-called Roman way of life. They then would progress to learning basic grammar, and then the study of poetry, while a select few would be allowed to progress to learning actual rhetoric, which is the equivalent of the Greek emphasis on oratory. This appears to have been the only way to train as a formal lawyer or politician in the Roman world. So this feeds on the idea that wealth is indeed essential. Now today, Latin is considered a dead language because new words are no longer being added, but up to 60% of all English words have their roots in the Latin language. Now the language appears to have existed on the Italian peninsula prior to the rise of the Romans, and it eventually became the language of Rome. The military conquest of Rome spread the language, all right? It spread the language out. And different vernaculars developed in different parts of the empire. You know, Latin's going to end up serving as the official language of the Catholic Church, the language of learning in the universities and of the medical field. This led to so-called Romance languages, such as French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, and Romanian. All of these derive from Latin. So education, although not universally available, was essential to the Romans. Now, what did they leave behind physically? What's it we remember about these people? The first and foremost is concrete. It's the literal building block of their empire. The Romans perfected the recipe for concrete, which had been around for centuries. But their secret is that they reinforced it with volcanic ash, and there was an abundance of this surrounding the Italian peninsula. Using volcanic ash allowed the concrete to set underwater, and the adhesive actually became stronger over time. This enabled the Romans to use new designs for their buildings and to free themselves from the restrictions of using just simple stone and brick materials. Domes, arches, and vaults could now be built and would harden over time. That's the so-called architectural revolution. Once the empire fell, concrete fell out of widespread use, and concrete itself wasn't really rediscovered, we would say, until the 1850s. Now, two structures attest to the strength and use of concrete. The first is the Colosseum, known as the Flavian Amphitheater. And it's kind of like how people think of the Parthenon when they think of Greece and Athens. People tend to think of the Colosseum when they talk about Rome. Now, construction began in the year 72, and it took 8 years to build. It was gradually improved over the next 20 years. The 3 emperors who presided over the construction were from the Flavius family. So that's why in its time it was called the Flavian Amphitheater. It could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators, and it hosted different forms of entertainment, like gladiatorial games, battle reenactments, public executions, and occasionally archaeological evidence does validate ancient accounts that there were mock sea battles that occurred because the arena could be flooded. Now, admission to the games was usually paid for by the emperor, and free bread was also provided. And this gives us the stereotype of how do you keep the masses from rioting? Bread and circuses. A shade awning was even used to provide protection from the sun. So first we have the Colosseum, next is the Parthenon. And this really has stood the test of time. The word Parthenon derives from a Greek word that translates to all the gods, but this might just have been a nickname for the building. It either refers to the statues of the gods that surrounded the building, or the fact that the building itself resembled a dome of heavens. And it was constructed during the reign of Augustus, and Hadrian rebuilt it around the year 126. Now, this is a decent picture because you get somewhat of an idea of the contrasting styles. It looks rectangular from the front, and it's attached to a rotunda that's under a concrete dome. That's a dome back there, and there's a hole that faces the sky. This hole is called an oculus. To this day, it remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. So concrete led to wonders like the Colosseum and the Parthenon, and it also led to the widespread construction of roads that connected the entire empire. If you've ever heard of the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, this is what it means. Roads were constructed to connect the empire together physically. And so it's connected through commerce and communication, but it provided the Roman legion with a clear path towards their enemies. So if you are a conquered people and you're thinking about rising up, all you gotta do is look at that road and understand that the legion can come straight through. Now, law stipulated that the roads had to be 8 feet wide to accommodate 2 carts passing each other. The goal is that 6 soldiers at a time could march next to each other side by side, and often soldiers were conscripted as construction workers in a conquered area. Over 250,000 miles of road were constructed. 250,000 miles. 50,000 of them stone paved. And this gives you a very good picture of the fact that, Roma, all roads lead to Rome. The entire empire was connected by this road network. So in a physical sense, this is what we have. When it comes to water, concrete allowed for the construction of aqueducts, which allowed water from the mountains to flow into Rome, and soon other areas of the empire followed suit. Romans understood the dangers of tainted water, and they preferred ceramic pipes to lead. They were already making the connection that lead in the water is not so good, but the lead levels were still pretty high. 11 aqueducts supplied Rome itself at its peak, and 200 cities received water from aqueducts at their peak. By and large, even though we see an image of one that's still standing near Rome, mostly this was an underground system. It was above ground only when necessary. And near the end, Germanic tribes destroyed aqueducts to cut off the water supply. Now this is an outdoor, or at least outside picture of an aqueduct. This is what they would look like on the inside. This one is in Spain, and you can see the importance of the mountains. These aqueducts were positioned just so that water could steadily flow downhill. If it's too steep, the water rushes. If it's not steep enough, well then, you don't get water. So these stood as the symbol of civilization. So aqueducts demonstrate the importance of water. And the bathhouses emphasize the importance of water and cleanliness to the Romans. Known as the thermae, thermal or large bathing complexes, these facilities were available for public and private use. Water would be pumped in via the aqueducts, or a bathhouse might just be placed near a river or stream, and the water would be heated for use. The process took a long time. The bathing process was lengthy, so bathhouses were gathering places. So in addition to having good hygiene, these centers had libraries and poetry rooms. They were like a spa, a restaurant, a mall, a library, all rolled into one. And we're looking at the most famous of these bathhouses in Bath, England. So bathhouses, aqueducts, cleanliness, this was civilization to the Romans. Now, interestingly enough, a great tragedy leads us to most of the knowledge that we have regarding Rome. We know a lot about Roman society because of Pompeii. Pompeii was near modern-day Naples, and we think about 15 to 20,000 people lived there. Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79. The entire area was covered with 13 to 20 feet of volcanic ash. This despite the fact that Pompeii was about 130 feet above sea level. It was still covered with all that ash. The eruption took about 2 days. Now initially, pumice rained from the volcano for about 18 hours, and so most of the inhabitants were able to escape. Thus far, only about 1,150 bodies have been recovered, and we'll get to that momentarily. Early the next day, the full eruption took place, and the whole area was covered with hot ash, so anyone left behind was instantly killed. The city was pretty much forgotten, and the first excavations weren't until 1592, when walls with paintings and inscriptions were uncovered. So intermittent excavations were conducted the following decades, and the 1950s is when the last large-scale digs took place. Now everything was well preserved because of the ash, but once exposed to the air, deterioration has begun, and to this day, it remains a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but unfortunately, it's deteriorating. Now, interestingly enough, some of the ruins give us this image of Roman life. They had their own amphitheater. This was their mark of civilization. Coloniae honoris spectacula. This is an ad for a gladiator competition at the amphitheater. This is a mosaic that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And yes, it translates to beware of dog. Even during Roman times, they used dogs for protective measures. Now, like I said, unfortunately, there have been bodies uncovered, but what we mean by that is the ash covered them so furiously that their bodies left an outline. Air holes were found during the excavation, so plaster was poured in there. And so we have an indication of what was going on when these poor souls died directly after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Terrible tragedy. Great for archaeology and history to get an image of Roman life, but a tragedy nonetheless as we look at the legacy, what the Romans left behind in terms of their society and culture.